The friendship began in an unexpected way during Ramadan in 2019, when Ronaldo was visiting a teammate who had invited him to break fast with his family. And during the evening, he met Imam Hassan, a soft-spoken religious leader from the local mosque who had been invited to share the iftar meal, and whose gentle wisdom and thoughtful explanations about Islamic principles immediately impressed Ronaldo with their emphasis on compassion, social justice, and community responsibility that aligned with values he had been trying to express through his charitable work and public advocacy. Though he had never encountered these ideas articulated through the framework of Islamic teaching that seemed to provide both spiritual grounding and practical guidance for addressing social problems that affected millions of people around the world. Imam Hassan was in his 60s, a scholar who had studied Islamic theology and philosophy for over 40 years while serving Muslim communities throughout Europe. And his approach to religious education emphasized understanding over memorization, practical application over theoretical knowledge, and interfaith dialogue over religious isolationism that built walls rather than bridges between communities that shared fundamental values about human dignity, social justice, and mutual responsibility, despite differences in religious practices and cultural expressions that were often emphasized more than the common ground that united people of goodwill, regardless of their specific theological beliefs or ritual observances. The conversations that developed between Ronaldo and Imam Hassan over the following months were wide-ranging and profound, covering topics from Islamic history and contributions to science and culture to contemporary issues about poverty, discrimination, and conflict resolution that required both spiritual wisdom and practical action from people who had resources and influence that could be used to address systematic problems rather than just individual symptoms. And the Imam's explanations helped Ronaldo understand how religious faith could provide motivation and guidance for social activism that was grounded in principles rather than politics, focused on long-term change rather than short-term publicity, and committed to serving all people rather than just members of particular communities or faith traditions. The educational component of their relationship was never formal or structured, but emerged naturally through discussions that began with questions about Islamic practices that Ronaldo had observed among Muslim teammates and friends, and gradually evolved into deeper conversations about the philosophical and ethical foundations of Islamic teaching that emphasized social responsibility, economic justice, and protection of vulnerable populations, in ways that challenged comfortable assumptions about wealth, privilege, and individual versus community obligations that were often discussed in secular contexts, but gained additional depth and urgency when grounded in religious principles that demanded accountability not just to human institutions, but to divine expectations about justice and compassion. Imam Hassan's teaching style was characterized by patience, humility, and recognition that understanding developed gradually through experience and reflection, rather than through lectures or abstract theological discussions, and his ability to connect Islamic principles to contemporary social issues helped Ronaldo see how religious wisdom could inform practical decisions about charitable giving, business relationships, and public advocacy in ways that were consistent with spiritual values while addressing real-world problems that affected people's daily lives and long-term prospects for achieving dignity and security that should be available to everyone regardless of their circumstances or backgrounds. The influence of these conversations became evident in Ronaldo's evolving approach to charitable work and public statements, with his advocacy for Palestinian rights, his support for refugee families, and his criticism of discrimination taking on additional moral clarity that reflected not just humanitarian concern, but understanding of religious obligations to defend the oppressed, care for the vulnerable, and speak truth to power, even when such truth-telling came with personal and professional costs that could affect commercial relationships and public popularity that had previously seemed more important than moral consistency. The friendship that developed between them transcended religious and cultural boundaries, while respecting the differences that made their exchanges educational for both participants, with Ronaldo learning about Islamic perspectives on social justice while Imam Hassan gained insights into how celebrity influence could be used to advance causes that aligned with religious principles about community responsibility and global solidarity. And their mutual respect and affection demonstrated how interfaith relationships could enrich understanding while strengthening commitment to shared values that united people of different backgrounds in common cause for human dignity and social progress. The practical impact of Imam Hassan's influence was visible in Ronaldo's increased involvement with Muslim communities facing discrimination, his more sophisticated understanding of Middle Eastern politics and history that informed his positions on conflicts affecting civilian populations, and his growing recognition that individual success created obligations to use resources and influence in ways that served broader purposes than personal enrichment or recognition. Obligations that were reinforced by religious teaching, but were applicable to anyone who possessed advantages that could be used to address suffering and injustice that characterized too much of human experience. The study sessions that occasionally took place between them were informal gatherings where Imam Hassan would share relevant passages from Islamic texts that addressed contemporary issues, explain historical contexts that illuminated current conflicts, and discuss how religious principles could guide ethical decision-making in complex situations where competing interests and pressures made moral clarity difficult to achieve without grounding in values that transcended immediate circumstances and personal considerations that often clouded judgment about what actions were required by conscience and principle, rather than convenience and self-interest. The community impact of their friendship extended beyond their personal relationship to include increased understanding and cooperation between Muslim communities and other groups who had previously had limited contact or mutual knowledge. With Ronaldo's visible respect for Islamic teaching helping to counter stereotypes and prejudices, while Imam Hassan's openness to interfaith dialogue demonstrated possibilities for religious cooperation that served common interests in promoting justice, peace, and human dignity, that were universal values rather than sectarian concerns that divided communities unnecessarily when they could be working together to address shared challenges. The educational initiatives that emerged from their collaboration included interfaith dialogue programs, community service projects that brought together people from different religious backgrounds, and educational resources that helped non-Muslims understand Islamic contributions to philosophy, science, and social progress, while helping Muslims see how their religious values could be expressed through engagement with broader social movements that shared commitments to equality, justice, and compassion that were consistent with Islamic teaching, but not limited to Muslim communities or exclusively religious approaches to social change. The personal transformation that Ronaldo experienced through their friendship was evident not just in his public statements and charitable activities, but in his approach to daily life, business decisions, and family relationships that reflected deeper understanding of moral obligations and spiritual purposes that gave meaning to material success while creating motivation for using advantages and opportunities in ways that honored the sources of blessing while serving purposes larger than personal ambition or achievement that could never provide lasting satisfaction unless connected to contributions that improved conditions for others who shared common humanity, regardless of religious or cultural differences. Years later, when Imam Hassan had become one of Ronaldo's most trusted advisors and closest friends, when their interfaith collaboration had inspired similar relationships between other public figures and religious leaders, when the educational programs they had developed together were serving thousands of people who were learning to appreciate religious diversity while working together for social justice that served universal human needs, Ronaldo would reflect that meeting. Imam Hassan had changed not just his understanding of Islam, but his comprehension of how religious wisdom could inform social action, how spiritual grounding could provide motivation and direction for addressing systematic problems, and how interfaith friendship could enrich understanding while strengthening commitment to values that united people of goodwill across religious boundaries that were often emphasized more than the common ground that made cooperation possible and productive for everyone involved in building more just and compassionate communities.